The short S.25 Sunderland was a British flying boat patrol bomber developed for the Royal Air Force by Short Brothers. It took its service name from the town and port of Sunderland in northeast England. Based in part upon the S.23 Empire flying boat, the flagship of Imperial Airways, the S.25 was extensively re-engineered for military service. It was one of the most powerful and widely used flying boats throughout the Second World War, and was involved in countering the threat posed by German U-boats in the Battle of the Atlantic. RAF Sunderlands also saw service throughout the Korean War and continued in service until 1959. It also took part in the Berlin airlift. Sunderlands remained in service with the Royal New Zealand Air Force until 1967. Sunderlands, converted for civil use, known as short Sandringhams, continued in airline operation until 1974. A single airworthy example remains on display in Florida at Fantasy of Flight development. The early 1930s saw intense competition in developing long-range intercontinental passenger service between the United Kingdom, the United States, France and Germany, but the United Kingdom had no equivalent to the new American Sikorsky S-42 flying boats of the German Dornier DuX. However, in 1934, the British Postmaster General declared that all first-class Royal Mail sent overseas was to travel by air, establishing a subsidy for the development of intercontinental air transport in a fashion similar to the U.S. domestic program a decade earlier. In response, Imperial Airways announced a competition to design and produce 28 flying boats, each weighing 18 long tons and having a range of 700 miles with a capacity for 24 passengers. The contract went to Short Brothers of Rochester, and while the first example of the new type, the S.23 Empire, was under development, the British Air Ministry was taking actions that would result in a military version. The 1933 Air Ministry specification R233 called for a next-generation flying boat for ocean reconnaissance. The new aircraft had to have 4 engines but could be either a monoplane or biplane design. Specification R233 was released roughly in parallel with the Imperial Airways requirement, and while Short continued to develop the S.23, it also worked on a response to R233s at a lower priority. Chief designer Arthur Gouge originally intended that a 37mm cow gun be mounted in the bow with a single Lewis gun in the tail. As with the S.23, he tried to make the drag as low as possible, while the nose was much longer than that of the S.23. The military flying boat variant was designated S.25, and the design was submitted to the Air Ministry in 1934. Saunders Roe also designed a flying boat, the Sarro A-33, in response to the R233's competition, and prototypes of both the S-25 and A-33 were ordered by the Ministry for evaluation. The initial S-25 prototype first took flight in October 1937. Design. The S-25 shared much in common with the S-23, but it had a deeper hull profile. As construction proceeded, the armament was changed to a single 0.303 Vickers K machine gun in the nose turret and 4 0.303 Browning machine guns in the tail. Then there was a change in the tail turret to a powered version, and Gouge had to devise a solution for the resulting movement after the aircraft's center of gravity. The unarmed prototype first flew on the 16th of October 1937. Following some flight trials, it was modified with a wing sweep back of 4 degrees 15 by adding a spacer into the front spar attachments. This moved the center of lift enough to compensate for the change center of gravity. The modified K4774 flew on the 7th of March 1938 with Bristol Pegasus 22 engines of 1,010 horsepower. As with the S.23, the Sunderland's fuselage contained 2 decks with 6 bunks on the lower one, a galley with a twin kerosene pressure stove, a yacht-style porcelain flush toilet, an anchoring winch, and a small machine shop for in-flight repairs. A crew was originally intended to be 7 but increased in later versions to 11 crew members or more. It was of all-metal, mainly flush-riveted construction except for the control surfaces, which were of fabric-covered metal frame construction. The flaps were gauge-patented devices that slid backwards along curved tracks, moving rearwards and down, increasing the wing area and adding 30% more lift for landing. The thick wings carried the 4 nacelle-mounted Pegasus engines and accommodated 6 drum fuel tanks with a total capacity of 9,200 liters. 4 smaller fuel tanks were added later behind the rear wing spar to give a total fuel capacity of 11,602 liters, enough for 8 to 14-hour patrols. The specification had called for an offensive armament of a 37mm gun and up to 2,000 pounds of bombs, mines or depth charges. The ordnance was stored inside the fuselage in a bomb room and was winched up to racks under the wing center section that could be traversed out through doors on each side of the fuselage above the waterline to the release position. Defensive armament included a Nash-Amp Thompson FN-13 powered turret with 4 303 British Browning machine guns in the extreme tail and a manually operated 303 on either side of the fuselage, firing from ports just below and behind the wings. These were later upgraded to 0.5-inch caliber Brownings. There were 2 different nose turret weapons, the most common, later, being 2 Browning machine guns. The nose weapons were later augmented by 4 fixed guns, 2 each side, in the forward fuselage that were fired by the pilot. Much later a twin-gun turret was to be dorsal-mounted on the upper fuselage, about level with the wing trailing edge, bringing the total defensive armament up to 16 machine guns. Portable beaching gear could be attached by ground crew so that the aircraft could be pulled up on land. The gear consisted of a pair of 2-wheeled struts that could be attached to either side of the fuselage below the wing, with a 2- or 4-wheel trolley and tow bar attached under the rear of the hull. Equipment and on-water management. As with all water-based aircraft, there was a need to be able to navigate on water and to control the craft up to and at a mooring. In addition to the standard navigation lights, there was also a demountable mooring mast that was positioned on the upper fuselage just after the astrodome hatch with a 360-degree white light, to show that the aircraft was moored. Crew members were trained in common marine signals for watercraft to ensure safety in busy waters. The craft could be moored to a buoy by a pendant that attached to the keel under the forward fuselage. When the craft was off the buoy, the forward end of the pendant was attached to the front of the hull just below the bomb aimer's window. For anchoring, there was a demountable bollard that fixed to the forward fuselage from where the front turret was retracted to allow an airman to man the position and pick up the buoy cager to toss out the anchor. A standard stock tanker was stowed in the forward compartment alongside the anchor winch. Depending on the operating area, a number of different kinds of anchor could be carried to cope with different anchorages. For taxiing after landing, the galley hatches were used to extend sea drugs that could be used to turn the aircraft to maintain its crosswind progress, or to slow forward motion as much as possible. When not in use, the drogues pilots were hand-hauled back inboard, folded, and stowed in wall-mounted containers just below the hatches. Operation of the drogues could be a very dangerous exercise if the aircraft was traveling on the water at speed or in strong currents, because the approximately 3 feet diameter drogue would haul up on its 5-ton attachment cable end inside the galley very sharply and powerfully. Once deployed, it was normally impossible to recover a drogue unless the aircraft was stationary relative to the local tidal flow. Another means of direction control on the water was by application of the rudder and aileron flight controls. The ailerons would cause asymmetric lift from the airflow and ultimately drop afloat into the water to cause drag on that wing. The pilots could vary engine power to control the direction and speed of the aircraft on the water. In adverse combinations of tide, wind, and destination, this could be very difficult. Access and servicing the Sunderland was usually entered through the bow compartment or on the left forward side of the aircraft. The internal compartments, bow, gun room, wardroom, galley, bomb room, and the after compartments, were fitted with swash doors to keep them watertight to about 2 feet above normal water level. These doors were normally kept closed. There was another external door in the tail compartment on the right side. This door was intended for boarding from a Brayby pontoon that was used where there was a full passenger service mooring alongside the wharf or similar. This door could also be used to accept passengers or stretcher-bound patients when the aircraft was in the open water. This was because the engines had to be kept running to maintain the aircraft's position for the approaching vessel, and the front door was too close to the left inboard propeller. Normal access to the external upper parts of the aircraft was through the astrodome hatch at the front of the front spar of the wing center section, just at the rear of the navigator's station. Bombs were loaded in through the bomb doors that formed the upper half walls of the bomb room on both sides. The bomb racks were able to run in and out from the bomb room on tracks in the underside of the wing. To load them, weapons were hoisted up to the extended racks that were run inboard and either lowered to stowages on the floor or prepared for use on the retracted racks above the stowed items. The doors were spring-loaded to pop inwards from the frames and would fall under gravity so that the racks could run out through the space left in the top of the compartment. The bombs could be released locally or remotely from the pilot's position during a bomb run. Normally the weapons were either bombs or depth charges, and the racks were limited to a maximum of 1,000 pounds each. After the first salvo was dropped, a crew had to get the next 8 weapons loaded before the pilot had the aircraft positioned on the next bombing run. The fixed nose guns were removed when the aircraft was on the water and stowed in the gun room just after the bow compartment. The toilet was in the right half of the same compartment, and stairs from the cockpit to the bow area divided the two. Maintenance was performed on the engines by opening panels in the leading edge of the wing either side of the power plant. A plank could be fitted across the front of the engine on the extensions of the open panels. A small manually started auxiliary petrol engine, which was fitted into the leading edge of the right wing, powered a bilge on a fuel pump for clearing water and other fluids from the fuselage bilges and for refueling. Generally, the aircraft were reasonably watertight, and 2 people manually operating a wobble pump could transfer fuel faster than the auxiliary pump. In sheltered moorings or at sea, fueling was accomplished by a powered or unpowered barge and with engine-driven or hand-powered pumps. At regular moorings, there would be specially designed refueling barges to do the job, normally manned by trained marine crew. These vessels could refuel many aircraft during the course of the day. Handling of the fuel nozzles and opening, closing the aircraft fuel tanks would normally be an aircraftman's task. Airframe repairs were either effected from the inside or delayed until the aircraft was in a sheltered mooring or beached. One of the serious problems was that the heat-treated rivets in the hull plates were susceptible to corrosion after a period in salt water. The heads would pop off from stress corrosion, allowing seawater to leak into the bilges. The only option was to haul the aircraft out onto the hard and replace them, usually at the cost of many additional heads breaking off from the vibration of the riveting. Damage control. A large float mounted under each wing maintained stability on water. With no wind, the float on the heavier side was always in the water. With some wind, the aircraft could be held using the ailerons with both floats out of the water. In the event of a float being broken off for some reason, as the craft lost airspeed after landing, crew members would go out onto the opposite wing to keep the remaining float in the water until the aircraft could reach its mooring. Aircraft with lower hull damage were patched to have the hulls filled with any materials to hand before landing. The aircraft would then be immediately put onto a slipway with its wheeled beaching gear beached on a sandy shore before it could sink. More than 2 fuselage compartments had to be full of water to sink the aircraft. During the Second World War, a number of severely damaged aircraft were deliberately landed on grass airfields ashore. In at least one case, an aircraft that made a grass landing was repaired to fly again. Marine growths on the hull were a problem. The resulting drag could be enough to prevent a fully loaded aircraft from gaining enough speed to become airborne. The aircraft could be taken to a freshwater mooring for sufficient time to kill off the fauna and flora growing on the bottom, which would then be washed away during takeoff runs. The alternative was to scrub it off, either in the water or on land. The takeoff run of a flying boat was often dependent only on the length of water that was available. The first problem was to gain sufficient speed for the craft to plane, otherwise there would never be enough speed to become airborne. Once planing, the next problem was to break free from the suction of the water on the hull. This was partly helped by the step in the hull just behind the craft's center of buoyancy at planing speed. The pilot could rock the craft about this point to try to break the downward pull of the water on the surface of the hull. Somewhat rough water was a help in freeing the hull from the water, but on calm days it was often necessary to have a high-speed launch cross in front of the aircraft to cause a break in the water flow under the aircraft. It was a matter of judgment of the coxswain to get the crossing close enough but not too close, because it was expected that some takeoffs would be protracted affairs. Often the crews were not very careful to keep within maximum all-up weight limitations, and getting airborne just took a little longer. On MKV aircraft, fuel could be dumped from retractable pipes that extended from the hull and were attached to the bomb room side of the galley aft bulkhead. It was expected that dumping would be done while airborne, but it could also be done on the water, with care to ensure that the floating fuel went downwind away from the aircraft. Operational history. Second World War. During the Second World War, although British anti-submarine efforts were disorganized and ineffectual at first, Sunderlands quickly proved useful in the rescue of the crews from torpedoed ships. On the 21st of September 1939, 2 Sunderlands rescued the entire 34-man crew of the torpedoed merchantman Kensington, caught from the North Sea. As British anti-submarine measures improved, the Sunderland began to inflict losses as well. A Royal Australian Air Force Sunderland made the type's first unassisted kill of a U-boat on the 17th of July 1940. During its service, the Sunderland Mark I received various improvements. The nose turret was upgraded with a second 303-gun. New propellers together with pneumatic rubber wing de-icing boots were also fitted. Although the 303 guns lacked range and hitting power, the Sunderland had a considerable number of them, and it was a well-built machine that was hard to destroy. On the 3rd of April 1940, the Sunderland, operating off Norway, was attacked by 6 German Junkers Ju-88 Sea fighters. It shot one down, damaged another enough to send it off to a forced landing, and drove off the rest. The Germans are reputed to have nicknamed the Sunderland the Flygenstachelschwein due to its defensive firepower. Sunderlands also proved themselves in the Mediterranean theatre. They flew many evacuation missions during the German siege of Crete, carrying a surprising number of passengers. One flew to the reconnaissance mission to observe the Italian fleet at anchor in Taranto before the famous Royal Navy Fleet Air Arms Torpedo attack on the 11th of November 1940. New weapons made the flying boats more deadly in combat. In 1939, during an accidental fratricidal attack, one 100-pound anti-submarine bomb hit the British submarine Snapper, doing no more damage than breaking its light bulbs. Other bombs had reportedly bounced up and hit their launch aircraft. In early 1943, these ineffective weapons were replaced by Torpex-filled depth charges that would sink to a determined depth and then explode. This eliminated the problem of bounce back, and the shock wave propagating through the water augmented the explosive effect. While the Brightly searchlight was rarely fitted to Sunderland's ASV Mark II radar, enabled the flying boats to attack U-boats on the surface. In response, the German submarines began to carry a radar warning system known as MATIX, also known informally as the Cross of Biscay, due to the appearance of its receiving antenna, that was tuned to the ASV frequency and gave the submarines early warning that an aircraft was in the area. Skills fell off drastically until ASV Mark III radar was introduced in early 1943, which operated in the centimetric band and used antennas mounted in blisters under the wings outboard of the floats, instead of the clatted stickleback aerials. Sunderland Mark IIIs fitted with ASV Mark III were called Sunderland Mark IIIAs. Centimetric radar was invisible to MATIX and baffled the Germans at first. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German U-boat force, suspected that the British were being informed of submarine movements by spies. In August 1943, a captured RAF airman misled the Germans by telling them that the aircraft were homing in on the signals radiated by the MATIX, and consequently U-boat commanders were instructed to turn them off. The Germans responded to Sunderland attacks by fitting U-boats with one or two 37mm and twin quad 20mm flak guns to fire back at their attackers, while Sunderlands could suppress flak to an extent with the nose turret guns. The U-boats' guns had superior range, hitting power and accuracy. Attempting to shoot down Allied aircraft did, however, prolong the U-boat's presence on the surface, which made the sinking the vessel easier. Nonetheless, fitting of substantial arrays of anti-aircraft guns temporarily decreased U-boat losses, while both Allied aircraft and shipping losses rose. As a countermeasure to the increased defensive armament of the U-boats, the Australians fitted their aircraft in the field with an additional 4 303s in fixed mounts in the nose, allowing the pilot to add fire while diving on the submarine before bomb release. Most aircraft were similarly modified. The addition of single, 50-inch flexibly mounted M2 Browning machine guns in the beam hatches behind and above the wing trailing edge also became common. The rifle caliber 303 guns lacked hitting power, but the Sunderland's defensive armament was nonetheless formidable. The aircraft's capacity to defend itself was demonstrated in an air battle between 8 Junkers Ju-88C long-range heavy fighters and a single Sunderland Mark III of No. 461 Squadron RAF on the 2nd of June 1943. This was one of several stories of the type's operations related by author Ivan Southall, who flew in Sunderlands during the war. There were 11 crewmen on board the Sunderland, 9 Australians and 2 British. The aircraft was on an anti-submarine patrol and also searching for remains of BOAC Flight 777, an airliner that had left Lisbon the day before and had subsequently been shot down over the Bay of Biscay, killing 17, among them the actor Leslie Howard. In the late afternoon, one of the crew spotted the 8 Ju-88s. Bombs and depth charges were dumped and the engines brought to maximum power. 2 Ju-88s made passes at the flying boat, one from each side, scoring hits and disabling one engine while the Sunderland went through wild corkscrew, evasive maneuvers. On the third pass, the dorsal turret gunner shot down a Ju-88. Another Ju-88 disabled the tail turret, but the next one that made a pass was hit by both the dorsal and nose turrets and shot down. Another destroyed the Sunderland's radio gear, wounding most of the crew to varying degrees and mortally wounding one of the side gunners. A Ju-88 tried to attack from the rear, but the tail turret gunner had regained some control over the turret and shot it down. The surviving Ju-88s continued to attack, but the nose gunner damaged one of these, setting its engines on fire. 2 more of the attackers were also hit and the final pair disengaged and departed, the only 2 to make it back to base. The Sunderland had been heavily damaged. A crew threw everything they could overboard and nursed the aircraft back to the Cornish coast, where pilot Colin Walker managed to land and beach the aircraft at Brass Sands. A crew waded ashore, carrying the dead comrade, while a surf broke the Sunderland up. Walker received the Distinguished Service Order and several of the other crew members also received medals. With the exception of Walker, a crew returned to Sunderland's. They disappeared without trace over the Bay of Biscay 2 months later after reporting that they were under attack by 6 Ju-88s. On the 2nd of June 2013, a memorial was opened on the green at Brass Sands. Post-war, at the end of the Second World War, a number of new Sunderlands built at Belfast were simply taken out to sea and scuttled as there was nothing else to do with them. In Europe it was removed from service relatively quickly, but in the Far East, where well-developed runways were less common and large land-based maritime patrol aircraft like the new Avro Shackleton could not be used so easily, there was still a need for it, and it remained in service with the RAF Far East Air Force at Singapore until 1959, and with the Royal New Zealand Air Force's No. 5 Squadron RNZAF until 1967. During the Berlin airlift, 10 Sunderlands and 2 transport variants were used to transport goods from Finkenwerder on the Elbe near Hamburg to the isolated city, landing on the Havel River beside RAF Gatow until it iced over. The Sunderlands were particularly used for transporting salt, as their airframes were already protected against corrosion from seawater. Transporting salt in standard aircraft risked rapid and severe structural corrosion in the event of a spillage. When the Havels aided freeze over, the Sunderland's role was taken by freight-converted Handley Page Halifaxes, with salt being carried in panniers, fitted under the fuselage to avoid the corrosion problem. For mid-1950, RAF Sunderlands also saw service during the Korean War, initially with No. 88 Squadron but shortly followed by Nos. 205 and 209 squadrons. The three squadrons shared the operational task equally with rotational detachments of 3 or 4 aircraft and crews based at Iwakuni, Japan. Missions lasting 10 to 13 hours were flown daily throughout the war, and also during the armistice period that followed, until September 1954. The Sunderland also saw service with the RNZAF until 1967. The French Navy Escadrille 7FE, which received Sunderlands when it was formed in 1943 as No. 343 Squadron RAF, continued to operate them until December 1960, the last unit to operate Sunderlands in the Northern Hemisphere.